to the second part, where we'll use the business process modeler and forms to capture information as part of our process so we can see what that looks like. I can.
I'll give it another
Yep,
minute.
we can now.
Okay, perfect. So there's sort of two tools, if you want to call it that. One of them is forms that we're going to show first. The second of which is workflow. They both do similar and very different things. It's sort of a hard concept to explain, but forms is a little more visual, sort of what you're presenting to a user, what you want it to look like when they're putting information in or taking information in order to review it, etc. There's also an underlying task assignment layer built into forms. Whereas workflow is a little more lower level. It's a lot more look at something that's in the repository and do something with it. Take a file, manipulate it. A little more of the grunt work, if you will, or the heavy lifting. So first we'll show you the new hire onboarding demo because it's nice and simple. So from a design perspective, the concept for this demo is that you've got a person that you have now hired, but you need to put a bunch of information into your system that sort of establishes them as an employee and creates the requisite files and make sure that we have everything, all our ducks in a row, if you will, for this new hire. So first off, I guess I'll show you sort of what that looks like. So just ignore my speeding through this next little part. I just want to give you sort of a visual idea of sort of what our end goal is going to look like. And then we'll sort of backtrack in terms of how we get there.
And as Sean's doing that, I'll give you a bit of sausage making in going through some of the things that we discussed to get here. A lot of this came from, people saying, I'm willing to do this work in the repository if you can make these parts easy for me. How do I get it into the system? Because so this came from that, and we actually built the prototype, and this is one of the things that came out of it.
So, as Chris said, this is something that was sort of designed with some requests from the client, if you will, to say, here's the information that we need to gather, and here's where we want to put it. So at a very base level, that's some of the information gathering that we go ahead and do before starting any of this process, which lets us sort of visualize how the process will unfold, and additionally how it's going to look visually. So you can see we've sort of added some theming to this. It's got our colors on it, and it's got some some logoing and obviously some fields where you can put some information. So I'm going to backtrack from here. So this is sort of our end goal of the information we want to take in, and let's sort of see how we got to this position. So first off, Chris, as he earlier mentioned, will sort of talk with the client and assess how does their analog process currently work. So currently they want to, they receive a resume, they put that in a file folder, they go through the interview process, they put some notes in the file folder, they make the employee sign some information when they come in the door, and that all goes into the same file folder. And once it's sort of at the point where you're hiring them, you then move that from a prospects file folder to another filing cabinet that's called, hires or employees. So how do we move that to a digital layout? So first thing we do is we have a number of tools at the side here in the form designer. So let me close that for a second. So in the forms designer, you've got all these tools that allow you to do different things. And this toolbox is constantly being added to, and then more features built in from the Laserfiche team as well. So in our case, we want to trigger a form to load where someone can input some data. So we're going to use this specific one here. So it's as simple as taking this and dragging it onto the form. And inside of there are some properties that we need to manipulate in order for it to do what we want it to do. So I'm going to just delete this one for a moment and go into the one that we've already got. So we go into this process here, and in there we can do a number of things. There's not a lot to edit, but it's basically saying, what do you want to call it, which is what's visually going to show up on the screen. So if you want your process to more accurately match your analog, you can have this say, all documents gathered.
And it's a really good point that what you want to do, whether you're using workflow or you're using the process diagrammer, is make sure that the titles make sense to you and also make sense from a process perspective. As you'll see, and it's grayed out, you can see there's two parts to this process. Enter new hire information and create a folder in Laserfiche. So that was, that's really a lot of the information. That's the 2 steps that people told me they really wanted to get done. Then you start getting into the details of how you get it done.
Exactly. So in our case, after Chris has gathered all this information out and sort of drawn it out, either on a whiteboard or on paper for myself to sort of look at, I take that and I move that into this digital framework, if you will. So we've established sort of 2 stages, one of which is where we enter the new hire information, and then what we want to do with it, which is in this case very basic: create a folder in Laserfiche and put all that entered information into that folder. So we have sort of 3 things happening. So we have the start of our event, which is all the documents have been gathered. Let's get the person to enter them. The next thing, if you follow the arrow, is a service task, and all this really does, I won't go into the nitty-gritty quite yet, but this basically saves items to Laserfiche.
And so what, one of the things that, so going back to that, do we automate it or do we let people do it? One of the things that we'd initially talked about is using quick fields and workflow to automate all of the scanning parts, because these were coming from paper documents. As we started talking to the HR clerks, what we found out was they didn't really feel like that was going to save them any time. Where they hated spending their time rather than doing that scan, because that's relatively straightforward, was in identifying the right template and the right metadata. So it becomes that version 1 problem, right? So version 1 is only going to take documents that they have somehow gathered and put them into the repository. Version 2, if they now feel that the next item that is a pain point for them is that scan piece, then we can start talking about what does that deep workflow look like to get them there.
Exactly. So now we'll get a little more into the nitty-gritty of each of these steps. So the gathered documents are sort of ready for entry. So we're going to sort of take a look at how do we design what the person sees when they're entering the documents. So in this stage, we have to say what form do we want to display to the end user. In this case, or in our demo example, this is going to be an HR person who has already gathered the documents and scanned them so they have a digital copy of them, or they've come to you via email and they're already in a digital format in some sense. So we choose the form. If it doesn't exist, there's an option to create a new one. So at some point that would have been done. And in this case, it created a new hire information form. So we can edit that form. And again, you're going to see there's a toolbar at the side where we can bring things into the display that change sort of what the user sees. So if you remember from the sort of first glance at our end result, all of these items were present on there. So we had a blank for employee name, we had a drop down for department, we had a start date, and we had some options to upload some files in that end result. And I could show you that again real quickly as well. This is sort of what that ends up looking like. So to customize that, it's as simple again as taking things from the left side of the screen and moving them on here. So if you wanted to say, employee birthday, because that's something you wanted to store, you simply add a field from this side, drag it onto this side, and title it with what you want. There's
and I think one one of the things, just to interrupt you there for a minute, Sean, to think about, irrelevant of whether we're talking about forms processes or workflow processes, is what do you want people to do with that data once it's in its home? So if it's going to live in the repository, so again, the reason I'm saying that is because variable names become very powerful objects for workflow to work on. And what we found out through this process of trying to marry the two is that even if we're talking about just workflow, the more that we can do it based off of variable rather than having workflow try and OCR something and find a field in the document itself, the more likely we are to have success. So as you're trying to think about workflows and forms, it's important to recognize that what Laserfiche does best is move information, delete document, build folders based on workflow, based on metadata and templates. So whenever you're building, you always want to have an eye towards what is our variable, what is our metadata and field that we're going to use for the next step of the automation.
Exactly. So in this case, the only two fields I'm going to fill out are what I want it to look like. So in this case, I want employee birthday to be the text I see, which is this field here, and then what I want that to be stored in the back end as. And again, this is referring only to the back end of Forms. So how does Forms store this data for later use by either workflow or the repository or another mechanism? And you can see, as I say, most of these are pretty self-explanatory. You can make the field required. You can make it read-only so that it is only something that can be edited by code or from another form. Text above, text below are helpful if you have a complex form and you want to add some helpful hints, or you have formatting requests if you want to store birth date, for instance, in year, month, day. We put that as text below, and it'll show up right there as a tooltip. There's some sizing things, some character limitations, and again, you can set default values. And again, this is where the variables come into play. Whatever we've named our variable will appear here for future forms and future entries. And additionally, you can use things that are part of forms. So if you wanted to have employee name be auto-fed from whoever's logged into Forms, you could do that as well. So are there any questions in terms of items that we see on the left that you would like to see on the right, or sort of how we get to this stage here?
Can you just maybe explain the concept of variables a little more? Like how are those used and why do those matter?
Yeah, we can certainly get to that. So it's actually sort of the next stage, if you will. So this is literally the visual design of what we want it to appear as, with some customization for each item telling us what we want those to be. So I'm going to take a look really quickly at employee name. I'm going to just show you what that variable is. So right now, this one is stored as employee name. So sort of keep that in the back of your mind for a moment.
Okay.
And we're going to go ahead and go back to the process diagram. So all of that was done within this first bubble. So the next thing we want to do is save the items that were entered, or that, when the person goes to that form and fills all those information items out, we want to save it to the repository. But we don't want to just save a generic item. We want to save what that person entered, which is where those variables come into play. So I'm going to go ahead and open this item up, which is, if you're looking for it on the side here, it's a save to repository task. I've simply renamed it to be more specific. So I'm going to double click on that. And there's a few configuration options that will need to be done. So this is essentially how does it connect to your repository? So what user is it going to use? What kind of access is it going to have? I've pre-configured that with a generic demo account that we have. What do we want to save? In this case, we only have one other item here, but if your process was more complex and had several stages, you could save the form from a specific level within that process. So in our case, as I say, there's only one item to choose. We want to save that form content. And variables, this is sort of where it comes into play here. So we want to save a document with whatever the form name is. So in our case, it's going to be new hire onboarding. I believe that's what we named the form anyway. And when it was initiated. And where do we want to save that? We want to save it in the repository at this specific path. And again, some of this is hard-coded, so this is just literal content that we've typed in. And then some of that is also variables that can be defined. And if you recall, there was a drop-down on that form for department, so you could choose which department they were going to be added to. So it'll pull that from a variable rather than from a hard-coded content. I don't know if that semi-answers your variable question, but we'll get to the employee name part that I had you sort of remember from earlier. So when we save to the repository, this is sort of the where it's going. And then what do we want to do with metadata is where you get into the fields area. So I'm going to open that configuration up. And in this case, we've basically said, I want to apply the template employee files, which is pre-existing in our demo repository, which has the following fields. And I've told it that I want to fill in the metadata in the repository. In the blank that is named employee name, I want to put in the variable that we have on that form. So that's sort of how it comes to play. And again, I'll delete this to show you how you fill this, because if you recall, all you saw was employee name for the variable. So you don't need to remember all these items, because on this little clickable on the side here, it lets you pick that. So in this case, we want to find on our list of field variables, we want to choose employee name, and it prefaces it with exactly how it knows about it in the system. So that sort of explains how variables come into play from form to where the repository is. I think, unless you have questions for this stage, we can actually go through a form submission and sort of watch what happens, watch the process unfold if you've got no questions at this point.
I have just one quick one, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
On your the right-hand side there, where it says new hire information, and then you've got the four other tabs beside it. Were those the upload buttons that you had on the previous?
They are, yes. For each upload button, I can define different things. So if I want to save this first attachment, if you will, to a different location, I can do that, and they're all customizable. And again, you can configure different metadata for each one.
Perfect. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. And those grow dynamically. So if I were to add another on my form, if I went to the editor and dragged another upload one on, you'd see another one in there immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and save this just so that our changes are saved. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, I'll show you one other thing here. There's two items that are sort of special importance when designing forms. First is access rights. So in our case, I'm able to see it, even though I'm not on this list, because I am a forms administrator. So sort of behind the scenes, I have more access than most people. Chris Winder is able to get here, and we've defined him as a process admin, so he'll be able to do all the things I showed you today. But if you've got general users or general groups that you want to have with a little more limited access, for instance, if your HR team, you don't want them modifying where things get saved or modifying the form itself, you can set them to submitter only, in which case they're only allowed to submit the forms, etc. And if you're not on this list and you're not a special case like myself, you simply can't get to the form. It would simply give you access denied error, I believe is the function that you get. So I'm going to leave Chris as a process admin just because he will need that right at some point. And publishing options is the other thing, which Forms is essentially running as a web server, right? It's an application within your framework that allows you to display information in a web page. So we are able to define sort of where that exists. So in our case, everything shows up on our server, which we have listed as this server name /forms, and then whatever we want to name it. So if we wanted it to say something different, we could have it, new hire could be the name of it. As soon as we hit done and publish, this URL now exists and is where you find that form that we created. So I'll go ahead and click on that so you can see what that looks like. So this is the form we created with all of our changes, and it exists at this URL. So those are sort of two initial configuration items you need to consider as well. You can have forms that are accessible, that have access control, but are not published, so that they can't be run from any specific. There's no way to get into them unless you know about them. That's one sort of level of security. And additionally, you can block access with the access control list.
The other value of having that publishable link is you can make those links available on your intranet site so that people don't actually have to ever go to forms. If you're just a submitter and you're not going to have forms access, there's no reason for you to get into the back end. You may as well just have that link on your intranet site. They can get to that. That'll open up the form for them. So again, it's some of those items around how do we do these things. Yep.
So I'm just on another screen right now, logging into the repository. So give me a brief moment to set that up so we can sort of see it unfold in real time here.
So that's sort of the forms part of it, the forms process part. The next part we're gonna show you is really what happens when you after you have the document and sort of use this to start going into the workflow part. Any sort of general questions on forms process and build, and we can take more time on it if you want, but I know you guys are looking at workflow as well.
I do have just one quick question, is whether all that data that's entered into the fields can be exported easily into Excel or into other, like, can we put it right away into our finance system, or is that easy?
There's definitely some integrations that are possible. You're probably looking more so at workflow for those types of things. So we can take a look at that when we're in there. So just remind me that you want to look at how to export data from workflow. Again, all the variabilization, if you want to consider that a word, allows us to do things in workflow that push content sort of where we want it, and we then know what that content is. It's not just a bag of data. It's now a enumerated list of things that we know.
Okay.
So in our scenario, based on what we had built in our form designer, which was back on the process diagram here. So in this box here, we defined where we want form content to be saved in the repository and sort of how we want it named. So assuming we haven't screwed that up too much, I'm going to go ahead and put in a test user here. Was born just Okay, it's coming up, so keep your calendars open. Department, so in this case, we're going to add this person to, let's say, facilities, just so that we have content there. Their start date, they're going to start the first of this month, so you can do, further back, further forward. If this is being entered in advance, you can do that as well. And this date picker here is not anything that we had to develop or code. Again, that's as simple as dragging that date tool off the side, and it comes pre-packaged with this utility. So in this case, we're going to add a resume. So I'm going to go ahead and upload. I've got some sample documents sort of pre-created. So I'll just load those. And it attaches right to the form, and you can see the name of it, etc. So I'll go ahead and just do all of these real quick here. And in this example, I'm simply using PDFs, but you could attach Word documents or any other type of document. You can also set filters so that it only allows specific types of documents. If you only want to, accept certain things, which one am I here? All right, so now we've got all of our documents attached. I'm just going to move something onto the screen before I hit submit here. So this is our demo repository, and under Government Human Resource, which I happen to recall is where we defined where these people would go, you can see that there is an IT department, in which there is Chris and myself and some example documents from some previous demos we've done. But there is no current folder for, where did we send this person? Facilities. So I'll go ahead and move that off screen for just a moment. I'll go ahead and hit submit. And a lot of this is customizable as well. So right now we have this set to give you a thank you form telling you that it's been submitted and show you an example of it, and give you some options for downloading, printing this form, or emailing this data to yourself or someone else. But again, all of this is customizable. You could have it redirect back to the initial form so that if you're doing a number of employees in a row, it can just rinse and repeat. Or if you wanted to go back to your main homepage where you have links to other things that you might be doing throughout the day, that can also be arranged. All of that is fully configurable. So at this stage, the HR person is complete. And what has happened as a result of us kicking that off, if we go back to the process document here, this item has triggered as soon as we hit submit on this form. So the saved repository has occurred. Just go ahead and make sure on my other side here it has. Let me flip to here again. And indeed, we can see that there is now a facilities folder. And as you would expect, we should see, based on the variables that we told it to name things, we should see a new folder called test user. And we do. And inside that, there's some metadata here as well. But inside of this folder, there should be our 4 documents that we attached. In addition, there's a 5th one because we told it to save a copy of the form. So I'll go ahead and click in there, and you'll see that we have indeed 5 items here. So we've got our 4 PDFs that were attached, and if you click on those, you can see that there's a preview on the right side here. This is just to give you an idea of what you're looking at. If you haven't seen it before, this is the web interface for Laserfiche 10. So it's similar to the client, except it's a web-based client. If you're not using that, it's definitely a lot nicer than the client, in my opinion, from a cosmetics perspective. And again, these have all been named and tagged and associated in the manner in which we told it. So I didn't show you some of those configurations, but essentially what I told it to do was whenever it saves the form, attach a specific template to them. When it saves 2 of those items, banking and benefits, apply this template and fill out specific fields. And when you do the resume and sign contract, apply the employee files template and apply some associated metadata. So again, variables comes into play here because if we look at resume, for instance, we can see that it is, oh, hang on, sorry. I have to go off of that for just a moment. That's simply a glitch within our demo environment here.
Yeah, so what it's doing is on the metadata side, because we have our two different demos using the same field. What it's doing on the employee name side is it's checking a external database to see if that user's name is in there, so that it can fill out the employee ID. So if Sean just goes to the drop down here.
Yeah, so it's essentially we've told it on one configuration that this box should always be populated with one of the items found in this backend table, and the test user is simply not in that table. And then another configuration, I've told it in this field place test user. So it's those two fighting together and those little gotchas.
So if you change the name to Anna Maria.
Yep.
So now an employee number comes up.
Yeah, it'll fill in more data as well. But again, that's a gotcha in our specific configuration. When you're designing it yourselves, just don't specify a field should be sourced from 2 places because it'll fight with itself. That's all I wanted to show in terms of forms. I guess is that. Are there any questions in terms of how we take form content and get it into the repository, which is sort of the stage we're at now?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Sorry.
Sure.
On the form itself, are you able to put a spot in there for an electronic signature?
You are, and did I close that window? I did not. Okay, so let me go back to that for a quick moment.
Sorry, I couldn't see it from my spot if there was it was obviously there.
Yep, there's a signature blank here, so I'll drag that on to show you what that looks like. Let me see if I can get it at the bottom here. Now one more. So we'll just leave it as signature, and we'll give it a blank of signature. That should be everything.
That's awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, there's a sign blank here now. Now I have it configured. You might have seen it that it'll use my default signature because I am in the system and configured. So all I have to do is click sign, and it stamps my stuff here. If I don't have that option checked, or if I don't wish to use this signature, I can actually go to the pen here, and this is what a normal user would see. So I can either type in, pick a style of my choosing. Don't believe Comic Sans is there, but you can make your choices as you see fit. And additionally, there's a draw option if you want to attempt to make a signature with a mouse, or if you have a pen pad connected or anything of that nature. And again, that saves it as that, and we'll save it as the form. So let me flip back to the repository and load the actual form up for a moment. Load this up a little higher, sorry. So this is the form content that actually got saved to the repository, which is essentially a snapshot without the background theming of what was submitted. So you can see, what details were actually attached and appended, from which you can pull metadata and associated items as well. And this is optional. You don't need to save a copy of the form if that's not something that you require for this specific process, or for any other process you design. All right, I think we're ready to go to workflow, unless you had some things to interject, Chris.
No, that was about it.